Angela, my job as a professor of Protestant theology with a focus on pastoral care, but also liturgy, i.e. rituals, naturally includes thinking about the funeral service. And yes, of course I also want to regain the spiritual aspects everywhere. And it was for milking mice, or pulling out your hair almost everywhere. Well, except for one person, everywhere I looked in the textbooks or so-called academic texts on the subject, they agreed that the funeral service is not aimed at the deceased, but only serves to process grief for the bereaved. On top of that, in the Protestant Church there is the fat. From my point of view, I'll say it clearly here, heresy, which is called the total death theory. When man dies, he dies completely. And this is directly directed against the old teaching of the immortal soul. The Catholic Church still has that in place. There is a kind of Catholicism for adults, and it says that we teach the immortality of the soul. So, from the perspective of a Protestant pastor who simply dutifully applies what he has learned, the deceased cannot be deader than death. Of course, a total reason for hopelessness, but I want to have mentioned it. When other people ask themselves why they find such an event so unappealing, and then it was a great stroke of luck for me when I was in Berlin that I was able to volunteer for a funeral service, and you trained me briefly, and afterwards my eyes lit up. I had never had such a beautiful funeral service before, so what does it mean to have carried out? And I am also clairsentient, clairvoyant, and you also gave me freedom in how I design the ritual. It was wonderful. So, and now I'll give you space to say what counts for you as I'll say it, lively funeral service, which is finally aimed at the deceased first. For those interested in theology, again, are Hans Martin Gutmann, professor of practical theology, evangelical theology from Hamburg. He was one of the first to say that the funeral could possibly also be about the deceased. So I never do church bashing because I don't like the church. I just want her to do a good job. Angela, I hand over to you.
Yes, I don't call it a wedding ceremony or a funeral ceremony, but rather a celebration of life and farewell. And that's very clear what it's all about. So that's the emphasis. So the emphasis is on the deceased and not on the relatives. We naturally feel abandoned in grief. That is, we experience the shadow, and those gathering dust experience the light. And if we go to a celebration and there is no possibility of hearing anything about the life of the person who has died, then something is simply missing. And if it's just about our grief, our pain, then I think it's misguided. Because I also ask myself, where is the deceased? And for me, for example, it is also important to address the deceased right from the start, because it's about the deceased and that he is the focus. It is also important that a speech is given, not for the relative, but for the deceased. Because after 3 days, as has been seen a lot, this ETA body, this life body, spreads out into the etacosmos, and such a great superconsciousness arises that if you have not been initiated in life, you cannot endure it, you fall into unconsciousness. And just like someone who wakes up from a coma and doesn't know what their name is or what they've done in life, you have to tell them that so that they can reconnect with their life, actually gain self knowledge. And that's exactly why you should give this speech. I now call it a work of art. We all work on our life's work of art, and the finishing touch is the last breath. And only then do you realize who this person actually is. You can't write a speech like that beforehand, only afterwards. Because all the covers fall off and then you realize who this person is. We just hide behind a lot of covers. And I think this speech should also be written in the first name form. I was at a training course at a funeral. There was a speaker who talked about the deceased, and then he spoke to the deceased, and suddenly the deceased was there. Then I thought, hey, that's exciting too. And then I thought, like in life, if I talk about you to someone else, then you don't have to listen to anything. But when I speak to you, you have to answer questions. And this is obviously no different for those who have died. They are present in a completely different way when they are spoken to than when you talk about them. And that is the important thing, that there is also a completely different presence of the deceased when you speak to him or speak to her, speak to her. So, and I think I should also try to get it out in this speech. That's why it only happens after death. What motive did this person have in life, and what was his or her task now? You usually only realize this after death, which is how many traces people have left behind. And portraying that is very important, and it's also become humorous, I think. Well, humor is just part of life. Even when someone is lying in state, for example, there are two sides of the face that can be studied. The right side is mostly serious, and serious has a brother, which is the humor, the left side. This is the mostly left side, the one that smiles. And in life, there are also these serious sides. We all have our weaknesses, so we grow from them. And you should also mention these weaknesses, but you can also do it lightly and humorously. Everything doesn't have to be moral, but it has to be humorous, and then at least it's mentioned. And then there is salt in the soup. Otherwise, there is no salt in the soup if everything is just said nicely. Then you have bad taste afterwards. You think something is wrong. But if you mention the weaknesses, then again, it's true. And that is also true for the deceased. It is important that the deceased hears this because it is also part of their development path. And that you also try to do a meditation around the deceased, for example. For example, everyone stands around the coffin. I think the most beautiful celebration is when the coffin is present, because then the body is present, although it is wrapped in the coffin. But then the soul and spirit are present in a completely different way than at an urn burial, where the essential things have already happened, cremation, for example. So if this is supposed to be personal, then the coffin should definitely be there. And then it is also available in a completely different presence of the deceased. It is also very helpful that people carry things themselves, lower them themselves, and close them themselves if possible. And it can heal a lot of things, even if you experience a beautiful burial. For example, it can also heal old, not so beautiful burials. So it's about healing through beauty. You don't have to do everything in a very pompous way. It can be very simple, plain and simple, but it has to be beautiful because beauty is the connection between the physical body and spirit and is healing. So it's very important how you design it, but it doesn't just have to be all pompous. The simplest thing can be the most beautiful.
The sentence was so beautiful, I'll highlight it again. It doesn't have to be pompous, but beauty is healing.
The other thing is that I then ask the relative to give the speech themselves, because if you then deal with these topics, these motives and life tasks, you can process your grief in a completely different way. And what deals with life again, that people and this journey from head to hand and what is written is sometimes very long, and sometimes something completely different comes out. And it just helps to get a little distance from the person's life, or to summarize things or get this overview. And then there are usually more, and it's easier to remove these motives and tasks. Well, I find it, and most people say, "Oh, Miss Forn, I won't be able to do it, and I don't have the strength for it." And then I say, yes, think of it as the greatest gift you can give to the deceased. This is the speech, this letter to the deceased. I usually find it written as a letter. The letter to the deceased is the greatest gift you can give to that person. And if you look at it that way, then most people have no problem keeping it up themselves. And of course, tears are allowed to flow every now and then. And if there is no other way, then someone else will step in or I won't care. But once you've done it, you're usually really proud that you did it and are surprised that it was easier than you thought. Because it is a gift and you notice that the deceased is also listening and is very grateful for it.